My husband tried to give away our baby to his sister because I was unfit to be a mother. I gave him two choices. Nate and I had been trying for a baby for 3 years. 2 miscarriages, endless fertility treatments, and then finally our daughter Lily was born healthy at 38 weeks. Those first few days home were everything I dreamed about. Nate would wake up for the 3 a.m. feedings with me, we'd sit together while I nursed, and he'd tell Lily stories about how much we wanted her. His family threw us a huge welcome home party. Everyone was thrilled, especially his sister Rachel, who'd been trying for kids even longer than us with no luck. She held Lily for hours that day, wouldn't put her down even when she cried. I thought it was sweet how much she loved being an aunt. Then Rachel started coming over every single day. At first, she'd bring food and help with laundry, which was actually helpful. But after 2 weeks, things got weird. She'd show up at 6 a.m. saying she wanted to let me sleep, but I'd find her in the nursery just staring at Lily in her crib. She started calling Lily my baby, instead of my niece. When I corrected her, she'd laugh and say I was being sensitive from the hormones. One morning, I woke up and found Rachel had completely rearranged the nursery because she said the layout was wrong for proper development. Nate said she was just excited and trying to help. Then Rachel started showing up during Lily's feeding times. She'd sit right next to me and watch, saying she was learning for when she had her own baby. She bought formula and kept insisting I should switch because breastfeeding was making me too tired to be a good mom. When I said no, she told Nate I was being stubborn and putting my pride over Lily's needs. He actually asked me to consider it. The breaking point was when I came back from a pediatrician appointment and found Rachel and Nate in the living room with papers spread everywhere. Rachel had printed out articles about postpartum depression, and they were making a list of my symptoms. Symptoms I didn't have. She said I seemed overwhelmed and maybe I needed more help than I was admitting. Nate was nodding along like an idiot. That night, Nate sat me down and said Rachel had offered to take Lily for a few weeks to give me a break. Not babysit. Take her. To her house an hour away. He said it would be good for me to rest and recover properly. I asked if he'd lost his mind. He said I was proving Rachel's point by getting defensive. I told him if he ever suggested giving away our baby again, he'd be talking to divorce lawyers. He slept on the couch. Rachel called the next day crying, saying she just wanted to help and I was keeping her from her niece. She said family helps each other and I was being selfish. Then she said something that made my blood freeze. She said maybe she'd be a better mother to Lily since she actually appreciated the gift of a child. I hung up on her. That weekend, Nate's mom called, saying Rachel told her I was struggling and refusing help. She offered to come stay with us to make sure Lily was being cared for properly. Then Nate's dad called, saying the same thing. Then his other sister. Rachel had told the entire family that I was an unfit mother. The next week, I found out Rachel had been telling her friends she was going to adopt a baby soon. One of them congratulated me at the grocery store for being such a selfless sister-in-law. That's when I knew this was never about helping me. Rachel wanted my baby and was trying to manipulate everyone into making it happen. So I started recording everything. Not to post anywhere, just for proof. Every visit, every conversation, every text. Rachel didn't know about the baby monitor app on my phone that recorded sound and video. Got her saying Lily would be better off with a mother who deserved her. Got Nate agreeing that I seemed too attached to the baby. Then I invited Rachel over for coffee to clear the air. Told her I wanted to apologize and work things out. She showed up with a social worker friend she'd convinced to do a wellness check based on lies about the house being unsafe. The friend took one look at our spotless nursery, fully stocked kitchen, and happy baby, and told Rachel she needed to stop wasting people's time. I acted confused and asked what Rachel had told her. The social worker said Rachel claimed the baby was being neglected and living in filth. I started crying and showed her all the texts where Rachel said she wanted to take Lily. The social worker told Rachel she needed professional help and left. Rachel tried to explain, but I told her to get out. When Nate came home, I gave him two choices. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I stood in the doorway staring at him, my phone in my hand with all those recordings ready to play. He looked up from the couch where he'd been sitting since Rachel left, his eyes red like he'd been crying, but I didn't care about his tears anymore. I walked over and stood right in front of him, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. I told him he had exactly two choices and he needed to pick one right now. He could pack his stuff and get out of our house tonight, or he could sit there and listen while I explained every single way he betrayed me and our daughter. He opened his mouth like he was going to argue, but I held up one finger and told him to choose. He sank back into the couch cushions, his face going pale, and said he'd listen. But I could already see it in his eyes. That look he got when he was getting ready to make excuses and tell me I was overreacting. I pulled out my phone and opened the baby monitor app, scrolling back through days of recordings. I hit play on the first one and turned up the volume so he couldn't pretend he didn't hear it clearly. Rachel's voice came through talking about how Lily would be better off with someone who really understood what a gift she was. Then Nate's voice agreeing that I seemed too attached, that maybe some space would be good for everyone. I watched his face while the recording played, how his eyes got wider and his mouth opened a little. He tried to interrupt, reaching for my phone, but I pulled it back and held up my hand. I told him he was going to sit there and listen to every single second of what he'd said about me. I played the next recording where Rachel said I was too tired to be a good mom, and Nate said maybe she had a point. Then the one where they talked about me being defensive and how that proved I wasn't thinking clearly. Then the one where Rachel said she'd been reading about postpartum psychosis, and Nate didn't shut her down, just asked what the symptoms were. I played recording after recording, watching him get smaller and smaller on that couch. His hands were gripping his knees and he kept shaking his head, but I didn't stop until he'd heard all of it. When the last recording finished, the house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Nate put his face in his hands and started crying, his shoulders shaking. He said he never meant it that way, that Rachel was just worried about me and he thought maybe she had some good points. I felt something cold settle in my chest listening to him make excuses. I asked him straight out if he actually believed I was an unfit mother, or if he was just too weak to stand up to his sister. He looked up at me with tears running down his face and said no, he never thought I was unfit. But Rachel kept saying things that made him worry, kept pointing out how tired I looked and how I snapped at her sometimes. He said he thought maybe giving me a break for a few weeks would help me rest and feel better. I stared at him and told him that's not how being a parent works. You don't just hand your 3-week-old baby to someone else for weeks because you're tired. Every new mom is tired. And asking to take our daughter away wasn't offering help. It was trying to replace me as her mother. He started to say something, but I cut him off. I told him I was done listening to excuses, and now here were his actual 2 choices. He could go to therapy with me, real therapy with someone who specialized in family issues, and he could cut off all contact with Rachel until she got professional help herself. Or I could call a divorce lawyer tomorrow and file for sole custody of Lily. I watched those words hit him like a slap. He said I couldn't be serious, that I was upset and not thinking clearly. I laughed and it sounded harsh even to me. I told him he had until morning to decide because I was packing bags for Lily and myself right now, and we were going to my mom's house tonight. He wasn't coming with us. He could sit in this house alone and think about what he'd done, about how he'd chosen his sister over his wife and daughter. He stood up like he was going to try to stop me, but I walked past him toward the nursery. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the diaper bag and started filling it with everything Lily would need. I grabbed diapers and wipes, bottles and formula even though I was still nursing, extra clothes and blankets. Nate stood in the doorway of the nursery watching me but not saying anything. I could feel him there, but I didn't look at him. I went to our bedroom and threw clothes into my overnight bag, not even caring what I grabbed. I picked up Lily from her bassinet and she made a little noise in her sleep but didn't wake up. I held her against my chest and felt my heart pounding. I was doing this. I was actually leaving. The thought made me feel scared and strong at the same time. I carried Lily out to the living room where Nate was sitting on the couch again, staring at nothing. I told him I meant every word I said. He had until tomorrow morning to decide if he wanted to be part of this family or not. Then I called Natalia while standing right there in front of him. Natalia answered on the second ring, and I could hear music in the background like she was at a restaurant. I told her I needed her to come get me and Lily right now. She didn't ask questions, just said she'd be there in less than an hour and to have everything ready. I hung up and sat in the armchair as far from Nate as I could get, holding Lily and waiting. Nate tried to talk to me twice, but I just stared at the wall and didn't respond. When I heard Natalia's car pull up outside, I stood up and grabbed the bags. Natalia came to the door and took one look at my face, and then at Nate sitting there looking miserable. She grabbed the diaper bag and my overnight bag without saying anything to him. She hugged me tight in the doorway, careful not to squish Lily between us. She told me I was doing the right thing, that what Rachel and Nate did was completely wrong, and I had every right to protect my baby. We loaded everything into her car and I got in the back seat with Lily in her car seat. I didn't look back at the house as we drove away. At my mom's house, Natalia helped me carry everything inside while my mom stood in the doorway looking worried. Once we got Lily settled in the guest room, I finally let myself fall apart. My mom took Lily and held her while I sat on the guest bed and cried harder than I'd cried since those miscarriages. Everything came pouring out, all the fear and anger and hurt I'd been holding in for weeks. My mom sat next to me with one arm around my shoulders and Lily sleeping in her other arm. When I could finally talk again, I told her everything. I told her about Rachel showing up every day and calling Lily her baby. I told her about the articles on postpartum depression, and Nate agreeing I seemed too attached. I told her about the social worker and the recordings, and Rachel saying she'd be a better mother. My mom's face got harder and angrier with every word. She said she never trusted Rachel's behavior at that welcome home party, how Rachel wouldn't put Lily down even when she was crying, how she kept staring at her with this weird, intense look. My mom said she'd thought about saying something but didn't want to cause problems with Nate's family. That night, I lay in the guest bed with Lily in a bassinet next to me, and my phone kept lighting up with calls from Nate. 6 times he called, and 6 times I let it go to voicemail. I could hear him moving around in the other room where my mom was still up. She came in around 11 and sat on the edge of the bed. She told me to let him sit with what he'd done, that he needed to feel the real weight of potentially losing his family. She said sometimes people don't understand how badly they've messed up until they face actual consequences. I asked her if she thought I was doing the right thing, and she said absolutely, that protecting Lily was the only thing that mattered now. I fell asleep with my hand on Lily's bassinet, feeling safer than I had in weeks, even though everything was falling apart. The next morning, I woke up to pounding on my mom's front door. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was barely 7 in the morning. The pounding got louder, and then I heard Rachel's voice, high and frantic, yelling that I was keeping her from her niece. My mom appeared in the doorway of the guest room already on her phone. She told me to stay inside with Lily and keep recording. I opened my phone's voice recorder while Rachel kept banging and screaming outside. She was crying and saying I had no right to take Lily away from her family, that she loved Lily more than anything, that I was being cruel and selfish. My mom's voice came through clearly telling Rachel to leave or she'd call the police. Rachel just screamed louder that she wanted to see her baby. My mom said the police were already on their way. I sat on the bed holding Lily and recording every word Rachel said through that door, knowing I'd need this evidence later. The officer showed up within 10 minutes, a tall guy with graying hair and a calm expression that made me feel safer just looking at him. Rachel was still yelling through the door when he pulled up, her voice breaking with these awful sobs that might have made me feel bad if I didn't know what she was trying to do. My mom opened the door and Rachel immediately tried to push past her, but the officer stepped in front and held up his hand. He asked Rachel to step back from the door and explain what was happening. She started crying harder and saying I'd stolen her niece, that I was keeping Lily from her family, that she just wanted to make sure the baby was okay. The officer looked at her for a long moment and then asked if Lily was her child. Rachel hesitated and said no, but she loved her like a daughter. He asked if she had any legal custody or guardianship rights. Rachel said no again, but her voice got defensive. The officer turned to my mom and asked if Rachel had been invited to the property. My mom said absolutely not, that Rachel had been told to leave and was now trespassing and harassing us. Rachel started talking faster, saying my mom didn't understand, that I was struggling and refusing help, that someone needed to check on Lily. The officer asked Rachel how she knew where we were staying. Rachel went quiet. My mom pulled out her phone and showed the officer the recording from earlier, Rachel screaming through the door about her baby. The officer's expression changed as he listened, getting harder. He asked Rachel if she had a relationship with the child's mother, and Rachel said we were sisters, which wasn't even true. My mom corrected her and said Rachel was the sister-in-law. The officer asked Rachel if she'd been asked to stop contacting us, and Rachel said yes, but it was because I wasn't thinking clearly. He told Rachel she needed to leave immediately, or he'd arrest her for trespassing and harassment. Rachel's face crumpled and she started begging, saying she just wanted to see Lily for 1 minute, just to know she was safe. The officer said that wasn't happening, and if she didn't leave right now, she'd be spending the day in jail. Rachel looked at my mom's house like she was trying to see through the walls, then back at the officer, then finally walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a minute just staring at the house before she drove away. The officer came inside and asked if we wanted to press charges. My mom looked at me and I shook my head. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was so tired and just wanted it to be over. He said he understood but strongly suggested we document everything and consider a restraining order if Rachel tried to contact us again. He pulled out a notepad and started writing up a report about what happened, asking questions about Rachel's previous behavior and the social worker incident. I showed him the recordings on my phone, and he listened to all of them, his jaw getting tighter with each one. He said what Rachel was doing constituted harassment and stalking, and the recordings would be valuable evidence if we needed legal protection. He wrote down his badge number and said to call him directly if Rachel showed up again. After he left, my mom locked the door and we just stood there in the hallway. Lily started crying from the guest room and I went to get her, holding her close while she fussed. My mom made coffee and we sat at her kitchen table, not really talking, just existing in the quiet. Around noon, a car pulled into the driveway and my stomach dropped until I saw it was Nate. He looked terrible when he came to the door, his eyes red and his hair sticking up like he'd been running his hands through it all night. My mom let him in, but her face was cold. Nate stood in the entryway and looked at me holding Lily. He said he'd chosen us, that he'd do whatever it took to fix this, that he'd cut off Rachel and go to therapy and anything else I needed. The words sounded good, but I'd heard good words before. I told him words were easy and I needed to see actual action. He nodded like he'd expected that. I said he needed to call his parents right now, with me listening, and tell them the truth about what Rachel did and what he'd allowed to happen. Nate pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed. His dad Hugo answered and Nate put it on speaker. Nate started explaining what had happened this morning, Rachel showing up at my mom's house and screaming through the door. Hugo interrupted and said Rachel was just going through a hard time with her infertility, that we needed to be more understanding. Nate tried to keep talking, but his dad talked over him, saying Rachel was family, and we couldn't just cut her off. Nate's voice got louder, and he said Rachel had tried to take Lily, that she'd manipulated everyone into thinking I was unfit. Hugo said that was a strong word, and maybe Rachel had just been trying to help in her own way. I felt my hands start shaking. Nate said there was more, that Rachel had brought a social worker to our house based on lies. His mom, Elodie, got on the phone and her voice was already crying. She said this was tearing the family apart and couldn't we all just sit down and work it out? I took the phone from Nate. My voice came out steadier than I felt, and I told them I understood infertility pain better than anyone after my 2 miscarriages. But that didn't give Rachel the right to try to take my baby. Elodie made a sound like I'd slapped her. I kept talking and explained about the recordings, about Rachel saying she'd be a better mother, about Nate agreeing I seemed too attached to my own daughter. Hugo started saying I was taking things out of context, but I talked over him. I told them about the social worker incident, about Rachel lying and saying Lily was neglected. My voice was shaking now, but I kept going. I said I had recordings of everything, and if they didn't believe me, I'd play them. Elodie started crying harder and saying this was all wrong, that family should support each other. I told her Rachel tore this family apart when she decided she deserved my baby more than I did, and I was done being understanding while everyone enabled her behavior. I said I'd spent weeks being told I was overreacting and being too sensitive and putting my pride over Lily's needs, but I was Lily's mother and protecting her was my job. Hugo said I was being dramatic and I needed to calm down. I told him I was completely calm, and he could either accept that Rachel needed serious help, or he could join her on the list of people who weren't allowed around my daughter. Elodie asked if I was really going to keep them from their granddaughter, and I said that depended entirely on whether they could accept reality. I handed the phone back to Nate and walked away, my whole body shaking. 2 days later, Natalia called and said her husband Gregory wanted to meet with Nate and me. Gregory was a family therapist and had heard about what was happening. We met at his office, a quiet room with comfortable chairs and tissues on every surface. Gregory asked us to each explain what had happened from our perspective. I went first and told him everything, trying to keep my voice steady. When I got to the part about Nate agreeing to let Rachel take Lily, Gregory stopped me and asked Nate if that was accurate. Nate nodded and said he'd thought it would help me rest. Gregory asked him why he thought his wife needed to be separated from her 3-week-old baby to rest. Nate didn't have a good answer. Gregory spent the next hour helping Nate understand how deeply he'd betrayed my trust by even entertaining Rachel's ideas. He asked Nate if he would have suggested giving Lily to anyone else for weeks, and Nate said no. Gregory asked why Rachel was different, and Nate said because she was family. Gregory explained that Nate's family had a pattern of protecting Rachel from consequences because of her infertility struggles, which taught her that manipulation works. Nate looked uncomfortable but didn't deny it. Gregory said enabling someone's harmful behavior wasn't love. It was avoiding the discomfort of holding them accountable. He asked Nate what he was more afraid of, his wife leaving him or his family being upset with him. Nate took a long time to answer. Later that week, I met with Christina Watkins, a family law attorney Natalia had recommended. Christina's office was downtown, all dark wood and leather chairs that probably cost more than my car. She reviewed all my documentation, listening to the recordings and reading through the texts. When she finished, she looked at me and said I had a strong case for a restraining order against Rachel. She said I could also pursue custody arrangements that limited Nate's family's access to Lily if I felt they posed a risk. I asked what that would mean for my marriage, and Christina said honestly, that depended on whether Nate was willing to prioritize his daughter's safety over his family's feelings. She said a lot of marriages didn't survive this kind of betrayal, but some did if both people were willing to do the hard work. I sat in her office and thought about those first days with Lily, before Rachel had poisoned everything, and wondered if we could ever get back to that. To Christina's office, I asked what came next. She explained that restraining orders typically required proof of immediate threat or repeated harassment, and while I had documentation of Rachel's behavior, a judge might want to see a pattern of continued contact attempts after being told to stop. She suggested sending Rachel a formal cease and desist letter first, which would establish clear boundaries and create documentation if Rachel violated them. I agreed, and Christina drafted the letter right there, spelling out exactly what Rachel was prohibited from doing. No contact with me, Lily, or our home. No showing up at places she knew we'd be. No sending messages through other family members. The letter went out that afternoon via certified mail. 2 days later, Elodie called me directly. Her voice cracked before she even said hello. She told me she'd been thinking about everything nonstop since our conversation with Hugo, that she couldn't sleep knowing her granddaughter was growing up without her. She said she understood I was protecting Lily, and she respected that, but watching her daughter fall apart was killing her too. Elodie admitted she'd known for years that Rachel's obsession with having a baby wasn't healthy, that after Rachel's late miscarriage she'd stopped being herself. She said they'd suggested therapy back then, But Rachel insisted she was fine, and they'd let it drop because confronting her was too hard. Elodie started crying and said she should have pushed harder, should have made Rachel get help instead of hoping time would fix things. Then she asked if there was any way, eventually, after Rachel got proper treatment, that we could work towards supervised visits. Not now, she said quickly, but someday. She just needed to know there was hope of seeing Lily again. I sat on my couch holding Lily while she napped on my chest, feeling the weight of Elodie's grief through the phone. I told her honestly that I didn't know if I'd ever feel comfortable with Rachel around my daughter. Every time I thought about those recordings, about Rachel saying I didn't deserve Lily, my whole body went cold. But I said I was willing to see how Rachel's treatment went, to watch if she actually got help and respected boundaries. I told Elodie that my first priority had to be protecting Lily, and their feelings about missing their granddaughter came second to my daughter's safety. I wasn't trying to be cruel, I said, but I wouldn't risk Lily's well-being to make anyone else feel better. Elodie said she understood and thanked me for even considering it. After we hung up, I cried into Lily's soft hair, hating that everything had gotten so broken. Gregory called Nate a few days later and suggested individual therapy in addition to our couples sessions. He said Nate needed to work through his family patterns separately from our marriage issues, that the two were connected but required different approaches. Nate agreed immediately and started seeing a therapist named Dr. Miller twice a week. At first I was skeptical, thinking Nate would just go through the motions to appease me. But after his third session, he came home looking shaken. He told me Dr. Miller had helped him see how his family's dysfunction had taught him to normalize Rachel's boundary violations, how they'd all learned to prioritize keeping peace over addressing real problems. Nate said he'd spent his whole life being told that Rachel needed extra understanding because of her struggles, and he'd internalized that to the point where he couldn't recognize when her behavior crossed into dangerous territory. He said understanding that didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped him see why he'd failed to protect us. Watching him actually do the work instead of just promising to change made something tight in my chest loosen slightly. I started therapy too, with a woman named Paloma Zamora who specialized in postpartum issues and family trauma. Natalia had recommended her after hearing me talk about how hard it was to separate normal new mom stress from the chaos Rachel had created. Paloma's office felt safe, all soft lighting and comfortable chairs, and she let me cry through our entire first session without trying to fix anything. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing wasn't postpartum depression like Rachel had tried to claim, but a completely normal response to betrayal and threat. She said my protective instincts toward Lily were healthy, not paranoid, and that I was right to trust my gut about Rachel's intentions. Paloma also helped me process the grief of losing the family experience I'd imagined, the big gatherings and close relationships that would never happen now. She validated my anger at Nate while also helping me see that people could genuinely change if they did the hard work. Our sessions became a space where I could say all the ugly, scared, furious thoughts I couldn't say anywhere else. 3 weeks after I'd given Nate his ultimatum, I started noticing real changes in his behavior. He didn't wait for me to ask him to handle things with his family anymore. When his dad called asking about Thanksgiving plans, Nate shut it down immediately and said we weren't ready for family gatherings yet. When Rachel tried to send a gift for Lily through their other sister, Nate intercepted it and sent it back with a note saying all contact needed to stop. He attended every therapy session, both individual and couples, without complaint or excuses. He got up for night feedings without me asking and took over more of the household tasks so I could rest. Small things, but consistent. The hypervigilance I'd been carrying started to ease just slightly, though I still checked the locks twice before bed and kept my phone close in case Rachel showed up again. Then Christina called with an unexpected message. Rachel's therapist had reached out through her, requesting a mediated conversation where Rachel could apologize and take accountability for her behavior. The therapist said Rachel had been working hard in treatment and understood she'd caused serious harm. She thought a mediated session might provide closure for everyone if it was done in a controlled setting with clear boundaries. I felt sick at the thought of seeing Rachel again, of hearing whatever explanation she'd come up with for trying to steal my baby. But when I talked to Gregory about it, he said it might actually help. He explained that Rachel taking real accountability, not just offering empty apologies, could give me a sense of completion. He said the session would happen at Christina's office with both our attorneys present plus Rachel's therapist, so I'd be completely protected. I agreed reluctantly, mostly because I wanted to look Rachel in the face and tell her exactly what she'd done to our family. The mediated session happened on a cold Tuesday morning at Christina's downtown office. Rachel walked in looking terrible, like she'd aged years in the month since I'd last seen her. Her face was pale and thin, her eyes red and swollen. She sat across from me at the big conference table with her therapist next to her, while Nate sat beside me and our attorneys flanked us on either side. Rachel started crying before anyone said anything, her whole body shaking with sobs. Her therapist had to prompt her twice to begin. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice came out broken and small. She said she'd spent the last month in intensive therapy trying to understand what she'd done and why. She cried through most of her apology, stopping to wipe her face and catch her breath. Rachel admitted she'd convinced herself that I didn't deserve Lily after everything she'd been through trying to have a baby. She said watching me get pregnant and have a healthy delivery when she'd lost her baby had broken something in her mind. She'd started believing that the universe had made a mistake, that Lily should have been hers. Her therapist had helped her understand this was her grief and trauma talking, not reality. Rachel said she knew now that she'd tried to manipulate everyone into giving her my baby, that she'd lied about me being unfit and tried to turn the family against me. She said there was no excuse for what she'd done, that she'd been so consumed by her own pain, she'd stopped seeing me as a real person with real feelings. I sat there listening to Rachel fall apart across from me, feeling a complicated mix of anger and pity. When she finished, I took a breath and told her I was sorry for her pain. I meant it. I knew what infertility felt like, what loss felt like. But then I told her she tried to steal my baby and that wasn't something I could just forgive because she was hurting. I said I understood she was sick and needed help, but understanding didn't erase what she'd put me through. I agreed to consider supervised contact in the distant future if she stayed in treatment and respected boundaries, but I made no promises. I told her Lily was my daughter, not hers, and that would never change no matter how much therapy she did. Rachel nodded and said she accepted that. Christina slid a document across the table, an agreement she'd drafted with Rachel's attorney. No contact with me or Lily for at least 6 months. Continued therapy with documentation provided to Christina monthly. Any future contact only through supervised channels with my explicit permission. Rachel signed it without arguing, her hand shaking as she wrote her name. Then she looked at me one more time and whispered that she was sorry, that she hoped someday I could forgive her even though she didn't deserve it. I didn't respond. I just watched her leave with her therapist, feeling exhausted and empty and relieved all at once. Nate wrapped his arms around me outside Christina's office building while I shook against his chest. The tears came hard and fast, all the anger and sadness I'd been holding back during the meeting finally breaking through. I wasn't crying about Rachel anymore, not really. I was crying for Hugo and Elodie, who I'd actually liked before all this started, who I'd imagined being involved grandparents at birthday parties and holidays. I was crying for those first perfect days after Lily was born, when everything felt magical and new, before Rachel's obsession poisoned everything. I was crying because my daughter would grow up never knowing her aunt, would hear stories someday about why half the family couldn't come to her events. Nate just held me tighter and let me sob, not trying to fix anything or make it better with words. When I finally stopped crying, my face felt swollen and my head hurt. We sat in his car for another 20 minutes before I felt ready to drive home. The pediatrician's office was bright and cheerful with cartoon animals painted on the walls. Lily was 8 weeks old now, chubby and healthy, smiling at anyone who looked at her. The doctor measured and weighed her, checked her reflexes and development, asked me questions about feeding and sleeping. Everything was perfect. Lily was hitting all her milestones right on schedule, gaining weight beautifully, showing no signs of stress or neglect. The doctor typed notes into her computer while I dressed Lily, commenting that I was doing an excellent job as a first-time mom. I asked if she could note that in Lily's records, explaining briefly about the family situation. She looked at me with understanding and said she'd document that Lily showed clear signs of excellent care and bonding with her mother, that there were zero concerns about the home environment or parenting quality. I texted Christina a photo of the visit summary before we even left the parking lot. One more piece of evidence that I was exactly the mother Lily needed. Hugo called 2 days later asking if they could visit Lily. His voice was careful, almost formal, so different from the warm father figure who'd welcomed me into the family 3 years ago. I told him they could come to our house on Saturday afternoon for 2 hours. No surprise visits, no showing up early, and they had to leave immediately if we asked. Most importantly, no mentioning Rachel or trying to convince us to give her another chance. Hugo agreed to everything without arguing. When Saturday came, I was so nervous I almost canceled. Elodie brought flowers and a new outfit for Lily, setting both on the coffee table without making a big deal about the gifts. They sat stiffly on our couch at first, making awkward small talk about the weather and Hugo's work. But then Lily made one of her little cooing sounds and reached toward Elodie, and something softened in both of them. They spent the next hour just being grandparents, making silly faces at Lily and taking pictures, asking about her sleep schedule and whether she'd smiled yet. Nobody mentioned Rachel. Nobody tried to defend her or minimize what happened. When their 2 hours were up, they thanked us for letting them come and asked if they could visit again next week. After they left, Nate said that was harder than he expected, seeing his parents try so hard to respect boundaries they never had to think about before. The support group met Tuesday evenings in a church basement across town. 8 women sitting in a circle, all dealing with family members who wouldn't respect boundaries around their kids. One woman's mother kept posting photos of her grandson on social media after being asked repeatedly to stop. Another woman's sister showed up at her daughter's school claiming to be picking her up. A third was dealing with in-laws who gave her toddler foods he was allergic to because they didn't believe the allergy was real. Listening to their stories made my situation feel less weird and isolating. These weren't bad people or crazy people, just mothers protecting their children from family members who thought their wants mattered more than clearly stated boundaries. The group leader taught us phrases for holding firm without getting pulled into arguments. She reminded us that feeling guilty didn't mean we were doing anything wrong, that people who violate boundaries often use guilt as a weapon. I left each meeting feeling stronger and less alone, with new strategies for the inevitable moments when Nate's family would push back against our rules. Natalia planned the gathering at her house on a Sunday afternoon. She invited 6 of my closest friends, the ones who'd been checking on me constantly since everything exploded with Rachel. Her dining room table was covered with food, and she'd made a banner that said, "Celebrating Strong Moms" in glitter letters. It was cheesy and perfect. We spent 3 hours just talking and laughing, everyone taking turns holding Lily and telling me how amazing I was for protecting her. Nobody brought up Rachel except to say I'd handled everything exactly right. Natalia made a toast about reclaiming the joy of new motherhood that had been stolen from me, and I cried happy tears instead of sad ones for the first time in months. My friend Jessica brought a journal and had everyone write advice or encouragement for me to read later when things got hard. By the time I left, my face hurt from smiling, and I felt lighter than I had since Lily was born. The drama with Rachel had consumed so much energy that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just celebrate my daughter and enjoy being her mom. The letter arrived 4 months after the mediation session, forwarded through Rachel's therapist like we'd agreed. Rachel's handwriting covered 2 pages, asking if she could send gifts for Lily's milestones. She promised not to include notes or try to contact us directly, just wanted to acknowledge birthdays and holidays with presents. The letter was careful and respectful, acknowledging that gifts didn't equal a relationship and that she understood we might say no. I brought it to my next therapy session with Paloma. We talked through the possible outcomes, what boundaries I'd need if I said yes, how I'd feel if Rachel violated the agreement. Paloma reminded me that I could always change my mind later if it became a problem. After thinking about it for a week, I decided to allow it. Rachel could send gifts through her therapist, who would forward them to us after checking that they were appropriate. No cards, no notes, no attempts to use the gifts as a way back into our lives. I told Christina my decision, and she updated the agreement, making sure Rachel understood that any violation would end the privilege immediately. The park was busy that Tuesday morning, full of moms with strollers and toddlers on the playground equipment. I'd brought Lily to meet Natalia and her kids for a play date. We were sitting on a bench watching Natalia's son on the swings when my friend Maria walked over with a weird expression on her face. She leaned down and quietly told me she'd just seen Rachel sitting in a car across the street, watching us. My stomach dropped. I looked where Maria was pointing and saw Rachel's gray sedan parked along the curb, Rachel visible in the driver's seat. She wasn't approaching or trying to talk to us, just sitting there watching. Maria said she'd been there at least 15 minutes before she noticed her. I grabbed Lily from her stroller and told Natalia we had to go. My hands were shaking, so badly I could barely buckle Lily into her car seat. Rachel had somehow known we'd be at this specific park at this specific time, which meant she was either following us or had access to information about our schedule. Either way, she'd completely violated the agreement we'd made just weeks ago. The gifts, the respectful letter, all of it had been meaningless. Rachel still thought she had some right to be near Lily, still couldn't accept that she'd lost all access to our family. I called Christina from the parking lot before I even started driving home. She answered immediately and listened while I explained what happened, my voice high and panicked. She told me to go straight home and stay there while she filed for the restraining order we'd discussed months ago. This was exactly the kind of escalation she'd warned me about, Rachel testing boundaries and seeing what she could get away with. Christina said the documented pattern of behavior plus this stalking incident would make the restraining order easy to get approved. When Nate got home from work, I was still shaky and upset. He called Rachel immediately, his voice cold and furious in a way I'd never heard before. He told her she'd just destroyed any possibility of ever meeting Lily, that showing up at the park was stalking and he was done making excuses for her. Rachel tried to say she just wanted to see Lily from a distance, that she wasn't hurting anyone. Nate cut her off and said she'd proven she couldn't be trusted with even the smallest privilege, and now she'd face legal consequences. He hung up while she was still trying to explain herself. Christina filed the paperwork the next morning and we had a court date within the week. The judge reviewed all the documentation we'd compiled over the past 5 months, the recordings and texts and the social worker incident, and now the park stalking. Rachel's lawyer tried to argue that she was just a grieving woman who made mistakes, but the judge wasn't buying it. The pattern was too clear, the escalation too obvious. The restraining order was granted that same day. Rachel had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, from Lily, from our house, and from any location she knew we went regularly. If she violated it even once, she'd face criminal charges. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt relief and sadness mixed together. This was really it. Rachel would never hold Lily, never be at family gatherings, never have the aunt relationship she'd wanted so desperately. But she'd done this to herself by refusing to accept boundaries, by choosing her obsession over getting real help. Hugo and Elodie came over that evening looking destroyed. Elodie's eyes were red from crying, and Hugo looked like he'd aged 10 years. They sat on our couch, and Hugo said they couldn't believe it had come to this, that their daughter now had a restraining order against her. Nate didn't soften or apologize. He told them Rachel did this to herself by stalking us at the park after we'd given her a chance with the gift agreement. She'd proven she couldn't follow even the most basic rules, and now she'd lost everything. Hugo started to say something about Rachel being sick and needing compassion, but Nate stopped him. He said they'd been making excuses for Rachel his whole life, protecting her from consequences because they felt guilty about her infertility, and that's exactly why she thought she could get away with trying to take our baby. If they'd gotten her real help years ago instead of enabling her, maybe none of this would have happened. Elodie cried harder, but Hugo went quiet, and after a long moment, he admitted Nate was right. They should have insisted Rachel get therapy after her miscarriage instead of just letting her obsess over having a baby. They should have seen the warning signs when she fixated on other people's children. They'd failed Rachel by protecting her from reality, and now everyone was paying the price. I told Nate's parents they'd been making excuses for Rachel their whole lives, and it finally caught up to everyone. Elodie wiped her eyes and said they knew I was right, that they'd see a therapist themselves to work through their guilt about Rachel's situation. Hugo asked if we could all move forward now that Rachel had legal consequences and was getting treatment. I said maybe, but it would take time, and they needed to respect that I'd never fully trust them after they believed Rachel's lies so easily. 5 months had passed since that day I gave Nate his 2 choices. We were in a better place now, functioning like a real team again, but something fundamental had shifted between us. I trusted him more than I did during the worst of it, when I'd wondered if he'd actually try to take Lily from me. He'd proven himself through hundreds of small actions, showing up for therapy every week, changing his work schedule to be home more, standing up to his family without me asking. But there was a scar there that we both felt. Some nights I'd wake up and watch him sleeping, remembering how he'd nodded along while Rachel listed my supposed symptoms of depression. The memory would hit me like ice water, and I'd have to remind myself that he'd chosen us, that he was different now. Nate knew about these moments. I'd told him in therapy that sometimes I still saw him sitting on that couch with Rachel's printed articles spread between them. He'd cried and said he understood, that he'd spend the rest of his life proving he'd never betray me like that again. Gregory helped us figure out what our marriage looked like now. We had a session where he asked us to describe our relationship, and Nate said he felt like he was on probation, always waiting for me to decide he hadn't done enough. I admitted that was partly true, that I needed him to understand his betrayal had permanent consequences. Gregory said that was fair, that Nate had broken something precious, and rebuilding would take years, not months. He helped Nate accept that I needed ongoing reassurance, that he couldn't just apologize and expect everything to go back to normal. Nate agreed without arguing. He said he'd rather spend his life earning back my trust than lose me and Lily by being defensive. That session helped more than all the others combined because Nate finally got it. He understood that his actions had changed our marriage forever, and he had to live with that. My mom packed up to go home but promised to visit every few weeks. She hugged me at the door and said she was proud of how I'd protected Lily, that not every woman would have the strength to stand up to her husband and his entire family. I cried because I hadn't felt strong during any of it, just scared and angry. She said that's what real strength looked like, doing the hard thing even when you're terrified. Before she left, she pulled Nate aside, and I heard her tell him he'd better never give her reason to come back and take me and Lily away for good. He promised her he wouldn't. Watching her car pull away made me sad because having her there had felt like a safety net, but I also knew Nate and I needed to figure out our family without her as a buffer. I started taking Lily to baby classes at the community center. There was a music class on Tuesdays and a movement class on Thursdays, and I met other moms who just wanted to talk about normal things. Nobody knew about Rachel or the restraining order or any of the drama. We talked about sleep schedules and teething and whether our babies were rolling over yet. One mom complained about her mother-in-law buying too many toys, and I had to bite my tongue because at least her mother-in-law wasn't trying to steal her baby. But it felt good to have these normal conversations, to be around people who saw me as just another new mom instead of someone who'd been through trauma. I exchanged numbers with a few of them, and we started meeting at the park between classes. Lily loved watching the other babies, and I loved having friends who didn't know my story. Nate came home one evening and told me he'd gotten a promotion at work. More money, better hours, and the option to take some time off. We sat at the kitchen table after Lily went to sleep, and he said he wanted to take the paternity leave he'd skipped when she was born. He'd only taken a week off initially, and then everything with Rachel had exploded, so he'd missed out on that early bonding time. He wanted to take 2 weeks now to just be with Lily, to have the experience that got stolen from us by the crisis. I felt my throat get tight, because this was exactly the kind of thing the old Nate wouldn't have thought of. He would have taken the promotion and kept working, not understanding what he'd missed. But this Nate, the one who'd been humbled and changed by almost losing everything, he got it. He understood what Rachel and his own weakness had taken from our family. I told him yes, that I thought it would be good for both of them. Rachel's therapist called Nate's phone and asked if she could speak to both of us. We put her on speaker, and she said Rachel was moving to another state for intensive treatment at a facility that specialized in infertility trauma and obsessive disorders. Rachel wanted us to know she was leaving, that we wouldn't have to worry about running into her anywhere. The therapist said Rachel had accepted she would never have a relationship with Lily and was trying to build a life that didn't revolve around babies she couldn't have. Part of me felt relief wash over me because Rachel being far away meant one less thing to worry about. Part of me felt sad that it had come to this, that Rachel's pain had twisted into something so dangerous she had to leave her entire life behind. But mostly I felt glad she'd be hundreds of miles away instead of one town over. After we hung up, Nate asked how I felt about it. I said I hoped the treatment helped her, but I was mostly just grateful Lily would be safer. Nate's parents called a few days later asking if they could have regular grandparent time now that Rachel was moving away. They said they understood they'd messed up by believing her lies, but they wanted to be part of Lily's life going forward. Nate looked at me, and I thought about it for a long minute. They'd hurt me by taking Rachel's side so easily, by calling to check if I was taking care of my own baby properly. But they'd also apologized, admitted they were wrong, and started therapy to deal with their guilt over Rachel. I told them they could visit every Sunday afternoon at our house. They had to respect our rules, leave when we asked, and never bring up Rachel or make excuses for her behavior. Hugo agreed immediately, and Elodie promised they would follow whatever boundaries we set. Their first visit was awkward. They were too careful, asking permission before holding Lily, leaving after exactly an hour even though we hadn't asked them to go. But by the third visit, they relaxed and just enjoyed their granddaughter. They brought age-appropriate toys, not the overwhelming piles Rachel used to show up with. They asked about Lily's development without implying I was doing anything wrong. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I bought a journal and started writing down everything that had happened. Partly for my own processing, working through the feelings that still hit me at random moments. Partly so I'd have a record if Lily ever asked why she didn't know her Aunt Rachel. I wrote about the early days when Rachel seemed helpful, about finding her staring at Lily in the crib, about the moment I realized she actually wanted to take my baby. I wrote about Nate's betrayal and the recordings and the social worker incident. I wrote about the restraining order and the therapy and the slow process of rebuilding trust. Paloma said documenting my feelings would help prevent them from turning into long-term anger. She said I needed to process the trauma instead of just pushing it down, and writing helped me do that. Some entries made me cry while I wrote them. Others made me angry all over again. But getting it all out on paper felt like releasing pressure from a valve that had been building for months. 6 months after everything started, Lily was thriving. She was sitting up on her own, grabbing at everything, laughing at silly faces. The pediatrician said she was hitting all her milestones right on schedule, developing beautifully. I was sleeping better now that she was down to one night feeding. The constant fear that had lived in my chest for months was finally easing, though I was still careful about who came around my daughter. I didn't leave her alone with anyone except my mom and Natalia. I checked the locks every night before bed. I kept my phone charged and nearby at all times, but I wasn't jumping at every sound anymore. I could take Lily to the park without scanning for Rachel's car. The hypervigilance was fading into normal parental caution instead of trauma response. Nate suggested we go on a date night, our first since Lily was born. My mom came to babysit, and I felt nervous leaving Lily even though I knew she was safe with my own mother. We went to a quiet restaurant, and it felt strange to be out without the diaper bag, without listening for Lily's cries. Nate reached across the table and took my hand. He said he wanted to talk about the future, about maybe trying for another baby eventually, about building the family we'd always wanted. I told him I wasn't ready yet, that I needed more time to feel secure in our marriage and trust that he'd protect our family no matter what. He said he understood and would wait as long as I needed. Then he promised me that he would never let anyone, family or not, threaten our little family again. He said he'd learned what mattered most, and he wouldn't forget it. I believed him because he'd spent 6 months showing me through actions, not just words. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror one morning while Lily napped and barely recognized the person staring back. Not because I looked tired or different physically, but because something in my eyes had changed. I'd become someone who could record conversations with family members, who could threaten divorce, who could get a restraining order against her husband's sister without flinching. 3 years ago, I would have backed down, apologized, tried to keep everyone happy even if it hurt me. Now I protected my daughter first and dealt with hurt feelings later. The change scared me sometimes because I never wanted to be the person who caused family rifts or made people choose sides. But I'd learned something important during those awful weeks after Lily was born. I could trust my instincts even when everyone around me said I was wrong. I could stand up to people I loved when my daughter's safety was at stake, even when my hands shook and my voice cracked. That strength didn't come naturally or easily. It came from pure fear mixed with love so fierce it surprised me. Every time I wanted to give in or apologize or make peace, I remembered Rachel saying she'd be a better mother, and Nate nodding along like an idiot. That memory kept my spine straight when guilt tried to bend it. The restraining order meant Rachel legally couldn't contact us for a year, and honestly that felt like breathing after holding my breath for months. But information still filtered through because Nate's parents visited every week now, and they talked to Rachel's therapist sometimes. Hugo told us one Sunday afternoon that Rachel was doing better in her intensive treatment program. She'd accepted that she wouldn't have a relationship with Lily, at least not for many years. Maybe never. Her therapist said Rachel finally understood that her actions weren't about helping me, but about her own desperate need for a baby after years of loss. Elodie cried when she told me this, saying she wished they'd gotten Rachel help sooner instead of making excuses. Part of me felt sad hearing about Rachel's progress because it confirmed she'd been genuinely struggling, not just being malicious. But mostly I felt relief that she was far away and getting the help she needed. It was sad but necessary, like Paloma said in therapy. Some people you have to love from a distance to protect yourself and your family. Rachel was one of those people now. Maybe forever. Nate's relationship with his parents slowly improved over the following months as they all worked on their family patterns with Gregory's guidance. Hugo and Elodie started individual therapy after Gregory suggested it during one of our sessions. They came to our house one evening and sat in our living room looking uncomfortable, which was fair because the last real conversation we'd had involved them defending Rachel's lies about me. Hugo spoke first, his voice rough like the words hurt coming out. He said they'd enabled Rachel her whole life because they felt guilty about her infertility struggles. Every time she crossed a line, they made excuses because she was hurting. They taught her that manipulation worked and consequences didn't apply to her. Elodie added that their therapist helped them see how they'd damaged Rachel by protecting her from reality and damaged their relationship with Nate by expecting him to go along with it. They were trying to break those cycles now, working on setting boundaries with Rachel even though it was hard. I respected that they were finally doing the work even though the damage was already done. Our relationship would never be what it could have been if they'd supported me from the start. But I could appreciate their effort to change and their genuine love for Lily. That was enough for now. I started planning Lily's first birthday party in October and decided immediately to keep it small. The big family gatherings I'd imagined before all this happened weren't realistic anymore, and trying to force them would just create stress. I made a list of immediate family and close friends, maybe 20 people total. Nate's parents were invited because they'd proven themselves over the past months by respecting our boundaries and showing up consistently for Lily. My mom, obviously, plus Natalia and her family because they'd been there through everything. A few friends from my mom group who didn't know about the drama and just thought I had a sweet baby. I told Nate the rules clearly when we discussed the guest list. No discussion of Rachel at the party, no drama, no tension. This was about celebrating our daughter's first year of life, and I wanted it to be happy. He agreed immediately and said he'd make sure his parents understood. Elodie called me a week later to ask if she could help with decorations or food, and I heard in her voice that she was trying. I let her bring a cake because it felt like a safe way to include her. Planning that party felt symbolic somehow, like I was reclaiming the joy that got stolen during Lily's first weeks. This time I was in control of who came into our space and what kind of energy they brought with them. Paloma helped me work through the grief of losing the family experience I'd imagined during all those years of trying to get pregnant. I'd pictured big holiday gatherings with cousins running around, close relationships with in-laws where they'd babysit and we'd do Sunday dinners. I'd wanted Lily to grow up surrounded by extended family who all loved her and each other. That vision died when Rachel tried to take my baby and Nate's family took her side. Even though things were better now, we'd never have that easy closeness I'd dreamed about. There would always be tension and careful boundaries and topics we couldn't discuss. Paloma said grief for the family you wanted is real grief that needs processing, same as any other loss. She had me write down what I was mourning, then write down what I actually had now. The list of what I had was shorter but more solid. Nate's parents who showed up every week and respected our rules. My mom who dropped everything to support me. Natalia's family who treated Lily like their own. A small circle but a safe one. Paloma said I needed to accept the family we had instead of mourning what we didn't. That was harder than it sounded because letting go of dreams hurts even when you know they weren't realistic. But slowly I was learning to appreciate what was real instead of grieving what wasn't. A year after Lily's birth, I was going through photos on my phone and found pictures from those first weeks home. Lily tiny and red-faced, me looking exhausted but happy. Nate holding her with this odd expression. Then photos from the welcome home party where Rachel held Lily for hours. I zoomed in on Rachel's face in those pictures and saw something I'd missed at the time, an intensity that went beyond normal aunt excitement. I felt angry all over again looking at those photos, angry at what Rachel and Nate's weakness stole from us. Those first weeks should have been pure joy, just us learning to be parents and falling in love with our daughter. Instead, they were tainted by manipulation and betrayal and fear. I'd never get those weeks back. Lily would never have that innocent beginning where her whole family welcomed her without ulterior motives. But then Lily crawled over to where I sat on the floor and pulled herself up using my leg, laughing at her own accomplishment. She reached for my phone with chubby hands and I picked her up instead, holding her close. She smelled like baby shampoo and the banana she'd eaten for snack. This was what I protected. This happy, healthy, safe baby who didn't know anything about the drama that surrounded her birth. I made hard choices that hurt people and damaged relationships, but I'd do it all again to keep her safe. That certainty felt solid in my chest, stronger than the anger or grief. Nate and I discussed having another baby one evening after Lily was in bed, sitting on the couch like we used to before everything got complicated. He said he wanted to try again eventually, give Lily a sibling, have the family we'd always planned. I was honest with him in a way I couldn't have been a year ago. I needed more time to feel secure in our marriage and trust that he'd protect our family no matter what. He'd proven himself over the past year through consistent actions, but that betrayal left a mark that hadn't fully healed. I wasn't sure when or if I'd be ready to be that vulnerable again, going through pregnancy and the postpartum period when I'd needed him most, and he'd failed me. Nate's face fell, but he nodded and said he understood. He'd wait as long as I needed because he knew he'd broken something precious, and rebuilding took time. Then he promised again that he would never let anyone threaten our family, that he'd learned what mattered most. I believed him because he'd spent a year showing me, not just telling me. But belief and readiness were different things. Maybe eventually I'd feel safe enough to try again. Maybe not. Either way, we had Lily, and that was enough for now. Life settled into a new normal that wasn't perfect, but was ours. My relationship with Nate's family would never be what it could have been if they'd supported me from the start. There would always be careful boundaries and topics we avoided, and a wariness on my part that wasn't there before. But Lily was safe and loved and thriving, hitting her milestones and laughing at everything. She didn't know her Aunt Rachel and probably never would. She'd grow up with a small but solid circle of people who genuinely cared about her without hidden agendas. I learned that being a good mother sometimes means making hard choices that hurt, choices that other people judge or don't understand. It means trusting your instincts even when everyone says you're wrong. It means protecting your child even when it costs you relationships and dreams and the family experience you imagined. I'd make the same choices again without hesitation, because Lily's safety mattered more than anything else. That knowledge sat solid in my chest, unshakable. I became someone fiercer and stronger through this experience, someone who could stand up to people I loved when my daughter needed protecting. That person looked back at me from the mirror now, and I was proud of her, even though the journey to become her hurt like hell.